How does a fighter with the looks of a movie star and the skills of a champion become one of the UFC's most insecure champions? Luke Rockhold's story is the ultimate paradox. A man who seemed to have it all, yet constantly battled with his own identity. From magazine covers to championship belts, Luke appeared to be the epitome of success. But behind his perfect image laid a deeper struggle, the pressure of maintaining that perfection, both inside and outside the octagon. This is the story of how a male model became UFC's most insecure champion, fighting not just his opponents, but himself. Luke Rockhold's story begins in the laid-back beach town of Santa Cruz, California, a place more synonymous with surfing than cage fighting. Born on October 17, 1984, Luke was far removed from the grim, no-nonsense fight gyms that would later define his career. He was a kid who loved sports. Whether it was soccer, skateboarding, or, yes, surfing, Luke Rockhold was an athlete through and through. But the world of martial arts, that came later. It was his mother, a jiu-jitsu practitioner, who first introduced him to the world of fighting. In the early days, Luke wasn't focused on MMA, but on judo, wrestling, and eventually Brazilian jiu-jitsu. These early years would be crucial in shaping his mentality in the gym and the cage. He was drawn to jiu-jitsu for its combination of technique, fluidity, and grappling control, elements that would later define his fighting style. And as is often the case with many great fighters, he became hooked. He loved the cerebral aspect of it. There was something deeply satisfying about taking someone down and controlling them on the mat. However, Luke didn't stop there. His ambition didn't just rest on becoming a decent grappler. He wanted to be great. He wanted to dominate. So, he took his talents to the American Kickboxing Academy, one of the most respected gyms in mixed martial arts. At AKA, Rockhold was surrounded by future champions, including the likes of Cain Velasquez, Daniel Cormier, and Khabib Nurmagomedov. The bar was high, and if you wanted to succeed in that gym, you had to put in the work. And Luke did just that. He didn't just want to be a middle-of-the-pack fighter. He wanted to be a world champion. It was at AKA where Rockhold developed the traits that would serve him so well in the cage: composure under pressure, an ironclad work ethic, and a relentless pursuit of perfection. His coaches quickly recognized his raw talent, his ability to absorb techniques, and his calm demeanor during training. While other fighters might have let their emotions take over, Luke remained cool, focused, and analytical. There was no panic in his style, just methodical control. The results weren't long in coming. Luke quickly rose through the ranks in regional promotions, then made his way to Strikeforce, the MMA organization that was considered one of the top promotions before its acquisition by the UFC. In Strikeforce, Luke continued to refine his skills. He was dominating opponents with a style that blended technical striking with elite-level grappling. By 2011, Luke Rockhold was a force to be reckoned with. In 2011, he captured the Strikeforce Middleweight Championship, defeating Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu specialist Ronaldo Jacare Souza in a dominant performance. This win not only secured him the title, but also solidified his reputation as one of the top fighters in the world. But while Luke was achieving success in the cage, his looks and persona outside of it were gaining traction as well. Little did anyone know the same guy who was collecting victories and title belts was also going to be one of the biggest faces in the UFC's marketing campaigns. His looks were nearly as deadly as his fists. By the time Luke Rockhold made his way into the UFC, he was already a champion. He had accomplished what most MMA fighters only dreamed of. But there was one thing he hadn't yet conquered: the UFC spotlight. Luke Rockhold wasn't just a good fighter, he was a great fighter. He didn't just have the physical attributes needed to succeed in the UFC. He had the it factor that made him marketable beyond the cage. His striking was smooth and technical. His jiu-jitsu was fluid and dangerous. He was a nightmare for anyone standing across from him. But let's be honest, this guy was a model. Seriously. His physique was textbook perfection. Chiseled abs, defined muscles, a perfect jawline, and the kind of face that could sell anything. He was the kind of guy who could transition from knocking someone out in the cage to stepping onto the runway for a photo shoot. His looks weren't just an accident, they were an asset. In fact, Luke's perfect looks became a huge part of his identity. While many fighters have to grind away year after year, hoping to build a fan base, Luke had an advantage from the start. He was a marketer's dream. Sponsors quickly took note of the way Rockhold's image translated beyond just fighting. His good looks, his presence in front of the camera, and his cool, effortless demeanor made him a star in the making. The UFC was quick to recognize Luke's potential, and they marketed him relentlessly. Luke was everywhere, on commercials and magazine shoots and representing high-end brands. His dual identity as a UFC champion and male model made him unique, even among the most marketable athletes in combat sports. It wasn't long before Rockhold's place in the UFC was solidified. He was the perfect champion, blending his championship-level skills with the marketing savvy of a pop star. His looks gave him a massive fan following, and his ability inside the cage only added to the aura of greatness that surrounded him.
Striking belongs to Rockhold in this one, just short.
But here's the catch. The more success Rockhold achieved in the public eye, the more pressure he placed on himself to maintain that perfect image. Sure, he was a fighter first, but the cameras, the sponsors, and the constant media attention were starting to become a heavier burden than he ever expected. And that is where the cracks began to show. Success is a double-edged sword. It is one thing to get a taste of fame and fortune. It is another to maintain it. The more Rockhold succeeded, the more the expectations grew. He wasn't just a fighter anymore. He was the fighter, the champion, the face of the middleweight division, and a star both inside and outside the octagon. The face of the UFC meant more than just winning fights. It meant selling yourself to the public, embodying confidence, and wearing your success like armor. It wasn't enough to just be a skilled athlete anymore. Rockhold was expected to embody the entire UFC brand. Cocky, brash, unapologetic. It was the same expectation placed on many top stars in the UFC. Whether it was Conor McGregor or John Jones, the promotion wanted their champions to sell the sport, to stir emotions, to get people talking. This led to an uncomfortable development in Rockhold's career: forced trash talk. Look, it's not that Rockhold wasn't confident, he absolutely was, but the trash talk didn't come naturally to him. He wasn't someone who thrived on trash talking his opponents in the way, say, a McGregor or a Diaz brother did. Rockhold was different. He didn't need to resort to cheap insults to make a statement. He had the skill, the looks, and the mentality to win without all of the verbal theatrics. But under the UFC spotlight, trash talk became a requirement. And so Rockhold tried to play the part. He'd drop lines like, "Do you know who I am?" in interviews, but it always felt like he was reading from a script. It wasn't authentic, and fans could tell. The more he tried to force a brash persona, the more uncomfortable it became. You could see it in his eyes. There was a dissonance between the fighter he was inside the cage and the persona he was trying to maintain outside of it.
How do you feel?
God, that guy's such a... I mean, you show your true colors after a fight, and that guy comes up to me and says, "You know where you are, huh?"
Michael, I'll bring you up to speed, Michael. Pick up the mic, Michael.
I actually picked you up off the canvas, and you, being the you are, came up to me and was a bitch
I shook
about
your
it.
hand, and you said, I already shook your hand and told me to f off, basically.
Do you know who you are? Do you know where you are, buddy?
Yeah, that's after you.
Yeah,
Hey, buddy,
you're
you got knocked the f
dick.
out. You got knocked out, buddy. Sit down, shut
You got
up.
lucky.
How's that jet lag,
You
buddy?
enjoy your
You
short-lived destiny, my friend.
All right.
This man can't compete with me. You know, I'll prove that anytime.
Are you did I just hear you say I can't compete with you? Is that what I heard? You just said I can't compete with you. I just knocked you out in the first round. Cold. Have you seen that replay, buddy? Your head was bouncing around like a pinball machine. I watched it. Yeah, watch it again.
And that discomfort didn't stay in interviews. It started to seep into his fighting style as well. He wasn't the same Luke Rockhold, who was calm, composed, and in control of every aspect of the fight. Instead, he became hesitant, almost tentative at times. A fighter who used to be in total control now seemed a little more vulnerable. There was no swagger anymore, only the weight of expectation. By the time Luke Rockhold entered the UFC, he was already a middleweight champion in Strikeforce. And with that victory over Chris Weidman in 2015, he became the UFC middleweight champion. The win was methodical, the culmination of everything he had worked for: striking, grappling, and his composure under pressure. Rockhold had been dominant throughout the fight, showing the world that he was more than just a pretty face. He was a force to be reckoned with. In that moment, everything seemed to fall into place. Yet behind that victory, Luke's internal struggle was just beginning. He had reached the pinnacle, but it didn't feel as satisfying as he had imagined. There was an emptiness to it, a quiet unease beneath the surface that couldn't be ignored. Winning the UFC title should have been a euphoric moment, but it came with a price. The weight of the championship belt was more than just physical. There was now an even higher expectation on his shoulders to remain the champion, to defend his title with the same dominance he had showcased when he first earned it. As champion, Luke was thrust into the spotlight more than ever. He appeared in interviews, press conferences, and promotional events for the UFC, all while trying to maintain that perfect image. But it was becoming clear that the pressures of being the face of the middleweight division, the ideal champion, were slowly starting to chip away at his mental stability. Despite his success, Luke wasn't completely comfortable in this role. He wasn't naturally the trash-talking, trash-burning type of champion. Sure, he could talk smack with the best of them, but it always felt forced, like he was trying to convince the world, and maybe even himself, that he was this brash, untouchable force. This internal conflict was growing, and as the UFC's promotional machine cranked up, so did the pressure. One of the more famous moments during Rockhold's championship reign came during the build-up to his fight against Michael Bisping, who would eventually dethrone him. The press conferences were full of fireworks, with Rockhold and Bisping exchanging insults. For Luke, this was supposed to be a celebration of his greatness. He was the champion after all. But the more he engaged in the trash talk, the more uncomfortable it seemed. Rockhold's cocky words didn't have the same ring to them as McGregor's, nor the same bite as a Diaz brother. It was almost as if Luke knew deep down that he wasn't built for the role of the brash champion.
It's his destiny, right? That's what he calls it?
Yeah, it is,
His
bud. It
destiny
is.
is to be
It is my destiny. You can't write this.
It's your destiny to be my little...
Destiny to be your little bitch.
Yet despite these vulnerabilities, Luke still managed to reign as the middleweight champion, even if his confidence in front of the cameras never felt truly authentic. There was always this underlying unease, this fragility that you could sense in his demeanor, no matter how much he tried to mask it. Fans were starting to see the cracks in the armor, but Luke was determined to maintain the illusion of invincibility. He had worked too hard for too long to let his insecurities expose him. It is often said that confidence is a fighter's greatest weapon, and for a long time, Luke Rockhold's confidence had been his calling card. But all of that came crashing down at UFC 199 when he faced Michael Bisping in a fight that would forever change the trajectory of his career. Bisping, who was widely considered the underdog going into the fight, shocked the world by knocking out Rockhold in the first round. The defeat was devastating, not just because Rockhold lost his title, but because of the way it happened. For a fighter who had prided himself on his calm demeanor and mental fortitude, this loss shook him to his core. Rockhold was knocked out cold by a left hook from Bisping moments in UFC history. Up until that point, Luke had looked nearly unbeatable, and for him to fall in such a spectacular fashion, especially to a fighter who is known for his resilience but not his knockout power, was a blow to his pride that he could not have seen coming. And the aftermath? The aftermath was a whirlwind of emotions. Rockhold, who had once exuded confidence and poise, now appeared visibly shaken. In the post-fight interview, there was no bravado, no trash talk, just an athlete who seemed lost. The words, "I wasn't good enough tonight," felt like a sharp contrast to the confident man who had once claimed to be the best middleweight in the world. And it wasn't just the loss that hurt. It was the realization that his perfect image, the one he had worked so hard to cultivate, had now been shattered. It wasn't just his pride that took a hit, it was his very sense of self. Luke Rockhold had spent years building up a persona of invincibility. But now, in the cold light of defeat, he was forced to confront the fact that even the best fighters have vulnerabilities, and that those vulnerabilities could be exposed at the worst possible moment. For many athletes, this kind of defeat would spark a period of reflection, of rebuilding. But for Luke, the struggle was much more immense. He didn't just need to rebuild his fighting skills, he needed to rebuild himself. The champion who had once walked into the octagon with an aura of invincibility now seemed fragile, uncertain, and unsure of his place in the sport. It was a blow that went far beyond the cage. In the months and years following the Bisping loss, Luke Rockhold's confidence was never the same. And it wasn't just his performances that took a dip. His public persona also started to unravel. Rockhold's interviews became awkward affairs. Gone were the cool, calculated answers that made him so marketable in the early days of his career. Now he seemed more nervous, unsure of himself, and less comfortable in front of the cameras. There was a noticeable shift in his body language, where once he stood tall, shoulders back, confident in his words, now he often appeared hunched, his voice uncertain. For someone who had spent his entire career cultivating an image of perfection, the fall from grace was a psychological burden that was hard to shake. His mental game, which had been so strong in the past, was now vulnerable. Rockhold himself later admitted in interviews that he had struggled with anxiety, and the pressure of maintaining the perfect champion image was a huge part of it. What made his insecurity even more apparent was how starkly it contrasted with his career in modeling. Outside of the octagon, Luke was still the handsome, confident figure that advertisers loved. But the reality was that this was an image, one that he could never fully escape. As he tried to balance being the poster boy for the UFC with the mental toll of being a fighter, he was constantly battling between these two versions of himself, the confident, handsome model and the insecure, doubting champion. The psychological struggle began to manifest in his fighting style as well. Gone was the calm, composed fighter who used distance and footwork to control the pace of a fight. Instead, Luke became more reactive, more prone to making mistakes under pressure. His striking became more hesitant, and his grappling lost its sharpness. It was as though the confidence he once exuded in the cage had disappeared. And without that confidence, his ability to control the fight had diminished. Rockhold's mental state was direct. He was no longer the fighter who could effortlessly float through exchanges. He was now the fighter who questioned himself with every move.
Well, I mean, yeah, things started to fall apart. Obviously, Kane retired.
Yeah.
You retired to some extent. Khabib was always in Russia. And then, it's like that energy that we provoked, that we had in the gym every day, was lost. It's not the same vibe, same energy, and I kind of forced it when I should have just probably took a step back.
After his loss to Bisping, Rockhold's career would take a series of unexpected turns. He never truly regained the dominance that he once had as the middleweight champion. Despite a few victories here and there, the confidence was all gone. His performances in the cage were inconsistent, and the insecurity that haunted him outside the cage seemed to find its way into his fights as well. His most recent performances showed signs of improvement, but the mental scars of his title loss were never far from the surface. In 2022, Rockhold attempted to make a comeback, this time in a different arena. He entered the world of bare-knuckle boxing, a move that seemed to many like a last-ditch effort to revive his career and reclaim his sense of self. But the reality of bare-knuckle fighting, where there's nowhere to hide and no safety net of the gloves, proved to be a tough challenge for Rockhold. He faced off against the tough, gritty Mike Perry, a fighter who embodied everything Luke wasn't. Unapologetically brash, tough, and confident in his own skin. Rockhold's performance in the bout was lackluster at best. The fight was a brutal reminder that sometimes a fighter's body can outlast their mind. After a lackluster showing, Luke would step away from the sport for good, never finding the mental clarity or the spark that had once made him a champion.
You can retract back to a mindset that's not particularly right. Surround yourself by good people and maintain the focus that any time, and if you don't respect everybody out there, you can fall. And I've experienced that myself, and I've made that climb back, and I know where to reset myself in.
Luke Rockhold's legacy is a complex one. On paper, he was a UFC middleweight champion, a Strikeforce champion, and one of the most talented fighters of his generation. He proved time and again that he could hang with the best of the best. He was a technical wizard with a well-rounded skill set, and he had the kind of marketability that most fighters would kill for. But the truth is, his time as a champion was overshadowed by his own insecurities. The more Luke tried to play the role of the confident, untouchable fighter, the more he struggled to embrace the reality of who he was. The cracks in his public persona were too large to ignore, and in the end, they cost him the title and perhaps his place among the sport's greatest. Luke Rockhold will forever be remembered as a fighter who had it all: looks, talent, and charisma. But in the end, it was his mental struggles, his insecurities, and his inability to fully embrace who he was that kept him from being the champion he could have been. And in a sport as brutal as MMA, where mental toughness is just as important as physical skill, that gap was wide enough to cost him his legacy.
Thank you, UFC. Thank you, Joe. Can't do this anymore. I gave it my all, and I just didn't. I'm old.